I come from a people, a black people, who have suffered in forms of being terrorized, traumatized, and stigmatized in the name of majority rule. So democracy cannot be simply majority rule. If it was majority rule, black folk could easily have remained enslaved to Jim Crow. It was not democratic processes. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was dictatorial. It's not democratic. Brown
To some degree, you could say that the civil rights movement in the 1960s shaped American political culture. Women getting the vote shaped American political culture because you brought more people into the political process. The assassination of JFK, to some degree, shaped American political culture by the fact that people always believed that there were other forces going on, working behind. In American society, American political culture has become very conspiratorial based. As a matter of fact, one of the best examples that shaped the conspiracy-minded political culture is a television show, one of the greatest television shows, The X-Files. If you watch The X-Files is based on a conspiracy that the American government knew about aliens.
But as far as next-gen leaders, you can literally just look at Africa. Those people within the next 100 years will be ruling the planet. If you want specifics as to leaders who in today can actually do it, qualities like that of Ibrahim Traore, essentially a president. He called himself a captain, but in reality, a president of Burkina Faso in West Africa, like qualities like that. He promotes sovereignty of his people, empowerment of his people, the stability of his people, structure and organization that does not come from outward or westernized help. He's more about, like I said, the institutions that benefit his people and not the corporations.
Coast West Coast tend to have more educated people, and they tend to be a little bit more liberal. Okay, the South has had a different political culture than the rest of the nation, because the South had the institution of slavery, and that had in slavery and emancipation had also colored that political culture in the sense that blacks were not from after slavery up until 1965. African Americans were not allowed to freely participate in voting. So that was a form of political culture. That was also a political culture that found it easy to use violence and intimidation against blacks. Americans of all the Western developed countries vote the least compared to other countries. Some people have said that's because Americans, those who vote the least, maybe they're satisfied with the way things are, or there are impediments to make sure that they don't vote. Like, I think the United States is one of the very few countries that doesn't make voting a national holiday or a day off. Why? I don't know. That's kind of odd. You would think that you want to encourage people to vote, so you would make voting day for a presidential election should be a free day, and people should just, go to the polls and then come back and, pop champagne and fly flags and things of that nature.
I think the biggest thing shaping the Americans' experiments today will be trust. Trust back in the day used to be around 73% as far as America or Americans wanting to believe that, their government would do the right thing on their behalf, had their best interests at heart. Today, that number's around like 15, 20%, so relatively low compared to what it was back then. Yeah, that trust doesn't like essentially evaporate out of nowhere. Dysfunction, corruption, corporate influence over lawmakers over decades, stuff like that kind of shapes an ideology of the people at the top, or the people that I essentially voted for aren't looking out for me.
There's a book called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. It came out in the early 1920s. And in that book, he talked about how Americans no longer were operating as communities. The metaphor of bowling alone was that there used to be numerous bowling teams in America. They stopped happening. Americans used to go to schools and churches and things of that nature. They have stopped doing that a lot. And in substitution for that, social media has now come into play. So social media has now taken the place of face-to-face interaction in community institutions. You can propagandize through social media to various constituencies. It can cause disruption and hatred, and it can also cause a vast amount of stupidity.
2024 alone, corporations lobbied around $4.40 billion or so. That's a few hundred times over what any like citizen or grassroots project could have ever accomplished. And that same year alone, grassroots projects had actually lobbied, I want to say, a few dozen times under than what corporations did. Grassroots in 2024 lobbied around 200 million. So that goes to show you right there, like a corporation can, in a 300-day time span, put out $4 billion worth of its own money to influence our laws, our legislators, and our essential way of life. I tell them, the oppression you fought so hard against, the injustices that you thought were wrong, never vanished upon your death. They essentially morphed and became stronger. They became more institutionalized, if anything. In today's time, we don't really need to integrate. What we need is economic leverage, resources, control over our own narrative, essentially. Schools, hospitals, our own media, banks, the whole nine. That's what we need.
We still held on to notions of democracy, but they were democratic critiques of the truncated democratic practices in America. So we're still wrestling with Plato's challenge. Plato's challenge will never go away. Will never go away. Because the fascist possibilities of any democratic experiment are always there. I don't care which part of the world you're talking about.